Good evening. Good evening, everybody. Good evening, Kieran. Can you hear me in Stoke
Yeah,
Climsland?
yeah, fine.
Very good. And Charlie?
I can
Very,
hear you, David.
very good. Very good. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our second Penbode virtual client evening. This evening, we have two presentations again. We're going to start off with a presentation from my colleague, Kieran O'Brien, which is on the stabled horse. Can we do it better? And then we're going to have a short break when you can stretch your legs, make a cup of tea, do some star jumps, whatever you want to do, just to get the blood circulating again. And then we will have a short presentation by me, which is really a review on gastric ulceration, which should dovetail in nicely with the work on the stabled horse that Kieran's going to present. At the end, my colleague Charlie Mould will field any questions which you have, so feel free to type them away into the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and Charlie will have a look at that as the talk goes forward and share any questions that there are. So hope you all thoroughly enjoy the evening. And I will now hand over to Kieran in Stoke Climsland.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining our presentation this evening. I hope you'll find it interesting and useful, and hopefully it'll make you think a bit, maybe. I've been interested in, for a long time, in how we keep horses, and particularly how we basically take a wild animal and put it in a confined space, and how we give it a happy life in that confined space. And a lot of research has been done, and I'm hoping to give you quite a bit of that research tonight with a little bit of my own opinions and experience as somebody who's kept and bred and ridden horses for 40 odd years. Although we've domesticated horses probably for 2,000 years, a lot of things we haven't really changed very much. And the most important one is we've asked them to live in a space 12 by 12, and we've told them get on with life. And it's obvious that a lot of them are not very happy and they're not coping very well. And there's a lot of research now which helps us to make that environment better for them. And I'm going to go through quite a wide area this evening: nutrition, sort of basic husbandry, air quality, these sort of things. And I'll dip in and out of a lot of sort of areas, and hopefully you'll find something interesting amongst that lot. So if we look at free living horses, what can we say about them? Well, they're in a stable social group. Horses are generally not joining and leaving, so they have established their own hierarchy. There's generally a good age spread, ranging from foals to older mares, a stallion. They can interact with each other, they can mutually groom. They feel safe because they're in a group and they're not in a confined space. They're isolated from infection by and large. They can move freely. They can eat when they like, for as long as they like. They can choose what they want to eat. And of course, they're breathing clean air. They're out in the open air, and they're not carrying weight. And they have a seasonal body weight fluctuation. And that is how nature intended it to be. Now, if we then take this animal and put it in a domestic environment, this photograph I took in a riding school, actually in Denmark. And that poor horse, his life basically is living in that small stall, being ridden probably for 2 or 3 hours a day, and then back in the stall. Maybe in the summer he gets in maybe a month of grass or something like that, but that's his life. And that is pretty much the opposite extreme to what I've shown you before. Now, to be fair, we have selected them to adapt to this kind of environment. And they're not wild, they are tame, and they've been domesticated, and we've bred from those that can cope with that kind of environment. But if you look at all the issues they have to face with, first of all, they may be in unstable social groups. If they're mixed, they come from different origins. We restrict their movement. We keep them in solitary confinement, very often with very little social interaction with other horses. And of course, we give them an unnatural diet because we have to do that to give them enough calories and protein, and vitamins and minerals to power, if that's the word, the work they're going to be doing. And of course, we bring them indoors, so the air quality automatically is poorer. Although they have adapted, they have evolved to live in an area, in a dust-free environment. As soon as we stable them, we challenge them with stable dust. We ask them to carry weight, and they don't have this seasonal body weight fluctuation. Now, as a consequence of all of these impositions, we end up with behavioral outliers who don't cope very well. Now, if you visited a zoo 20 or 30 years ago, you would have seen tigers and lions caged like this, walking up and down, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. Now, nowadays, you never see that because it's generally accepted that we mustn't keep them in that kind of environment. They must have space. But what happens with horses? And just take a look at this video. Just run it. So this is what I would call a perfect storm. We've got 3 Arabian horses, a very sensitive breed. They're about to be fed, so they've got restricted forward movement. They've got no opportunity for socialization. So in a way, this is the kind of equivalent, really, to some extent, of what we used to do with lions and tigers and caged animals in zoos. Now, we can improve this quite a lot, and I hope by going through these various issues tonight, I'll give you some ideas. So let's just have a look at other scenarios. This horse here is a windsucker. He's been prevented from windsucking by an electric cable along the top of the gate. So what does he do? What does he do? He becomes a weaver. This horse down here, now he is another weaver, but he has got quite a bizarre motion, round, a circular motion. So that horse is behaving in a completely abnormal way. And we've made him like that. And we should see if we can do something about it. So if we go to, I'll just show you some more. Here's another one. Now, I'm not sure if this is true stereotypic behavior or whether he's actually just trying to scrape some wood off. This horse here is obviously a weaver. A barrier has been put up to stop him weaving, and he's developed this kind of bizarre trembling sort of mouth champing behavior to cope with what he's been put in. So these are the sort of, now he's probably a thoroughbred, so he's less good at coping with that kind of situation. So these are the kind of situations I see every day in my working life. Right, now, so these horses we could say have got maladaptation. So here's another one. This horse is a windsucker. And we call weaving and windsucking stable vices as though it's kind of the horse's fault. He's doing something awful. But actually, it's better called stereotypic behavior. It's failure to adapt to in the situation we've put them in. We see, and as well as vices, we see wood chewing. They get respiratory disease because they are housed, lameness because of the abnormal movements they have to do, gastric ulceration, colic, anxiety, all these sort of things really are symptoms of maladaptation to the stable environment. So if we have to ask the basic question, well, then do we really need to stable horses? And you could say it's more natural, they can interact socially, and we do know that horses can compete at a high level from grass, provided their weight is controlled. And we know they have a much lower risk of colic. They tend by and large not to show this sort of stereotypic behavior. However, they will damage the land, or there may be limited availability. We may have issues with weight control, flies, parasites, risk of injury, interacting with each other unless we pen them individually. Keeping them clean can be a nightmare. It's very difficult to feed them individually if they're in a social group. And of course, the personnel who look after them do not want to tread out into the mud every day to look after the horses. Now, so while mixing horses together is a good idea, it can cause problems, and the main problems is aggression. A survey was done of quite a lot of horses, 652 owners in the northwest of England. 40% of those horses had sustained an injury at grass in the last 12 months, or at least 89% of them occurred at grass. And the factors that cause an increased risk of aggressive interactions between horses would be something like large group size, a recent arrival, either the aggressor or the horse that the others were aggressive to. And cobs and ponies were much less aggressive and much less likely to be injured. And this is the classical example. The gateway here There was an electric fence that was supposed to keep horses away from this gateway, but unfortunately it fell down and wasn't looked after. This is a mare. She struck out through this gate, pulled it off at another horse, a gelding probably, pulled it off the hinges, and we get these fairly horrible injuries. So if we are going to leave horses at grass more than we do at the moment as an alternative to stabling, how can we minimize aggressive interactions? Well, one thing is to keep the group stable, and the group size has a big effect, much less jockeying for position. The smaller the group pairs are ideal. Try and keep the sexes apart. A lot of geldings get kicked by mares. If it is in a big group, try and have a big age spread. Meeting first across the fence, I'm not sure how effective that is. It would need to be a very safe fence. This gate, this is one of my gates actually, it's a sheeted gate, so they can talk to each other and they can't injure each other and nothing can strike out. And the fence on either side is electrified, so they can talk across this in a safe way. And then once a new horse arrives, essentially it's got two challenges. One is it doesn't know the layout, and secondly, it doesn't know the horses. So one solution is to turn the newcomer out first alone into the paddock, so it familiarizes itself with the boundaries, it canters round, it sees where the corners are and the gates are and sort of thing, and then add the resident horses one at a time and watch them, see the dynamics, rather than put this horse in a strange field with a lot of strange horses. So that's quite a good solution where you have a new horse arriving. Obviously, removing the hind shoes is ideal. The most important thing is the fences must prevent interaction, because most of the injuries I see in horses are horses interacting across a fence, striking out at each other, kicking out at each other, and some of those injuries can be very severe. So this is one of my fields. I've got an electric strand on both sides. So the horses sort of half talk to each other, but they can't really interact. And this is a stud in Newmarket where they've rounded the corners, so no horse can get trapped. So that's quite a safe environment. So if we decide, well, we can't really turn them out, we're going to have to stable them, then what are the targets that we should aim for? Well, first of all, we should have better socialization. We should try and give them a natural diet. It should be comfortable for them, in other words, they should sleep for the required amount and feel safe there. And the air they breathe should be clean. So if we look at all these different targets, first thing I'm going to show you is what are the time budgets for stabled horses. These are free living horses. They spend about 60% of their time eating, 10% of their time lying down, and then the rest doing other things like standing and not doing very much. And then if we compare that with horses that are loose housed in a straw yard with ad-lib food, we find it's almost identical. So you could argue that if we're going to house horses, wouldn't it be great if we could keep them in groups? And there's now a lot of research going on at the moment as to how we can do that in a safe way, by having individual feeding pens and that sort of thing. But then if we compare that group house in a straw yard that I've just shown you with a horse kept in single boxes, restricted fiber, they can only see others over the door, and look at the difference. A lot of time standing around, not doing very much, eating because for a relatively short space of time because the fiber is restricted, the forage is restricted. So there's a huge difference. And it's not surprising that stabled horses develop vices, colic, bed eating, all these sort of things. And to give you some idea of how stabling is a risk factor for colic, if you look here, the hours stabled and the odds ratio of developing colic. So in other words, a horse that's stabled for 19 to 24 hours is 8 times more likely to suffer from colic than a horse that's stabled from 0 to 6 hours. In other words, a horse at grass. So stabling is a big risk for colic. So if we were to design the perfect stable, what would we try and have? Well, the first thing would be space and freedom to move. We would like them to be able to interact with others, to express their normal behavior. We would like them to have food available all the time, ideally forage. And we would like the air to be clean, and we want them to feel safe. But of course, from our point of view as owners, we want the stables to be economical to build, labor saving, pleasant and efficient to work in, electric light, all that kind of thing. So can we combine the two? Well, a conventional system like this, there's no social interaction, the roof is low, probably poor air quality. So this is the conventional system. And how can we improve it? The first thing we need to do is, what is the evidence that horses don't like stables? And I think we can reliably establish that. What is it they don't like about them? If we look at, for example, the instance of abnormal behavior, and I'm talking about now stereotypic behavior or stable vices, you'll see that it's quite a high. 1 in 3 dressage horses in this survey had some sort of abnormal behavior. Event horses, not much different. Endurance horses, a bit lower. Of course, we're talking breed differences here now to some extent. But one key finding of this research study was that the prevalence of this abnormal behavior was directly related to the time outside the stable. In other words, endurance horses spend more time out in the stable and they had far less abnormal behavior. And then if you look at, this was a survey at racehorse training yards, a very big study, thoroughbreds, the risk of horses performing abnormal behavior increased with the amount of forage, inversely. That is, so if the less forage they had, the more likely they were to behave abnormally. Bedding types other than straw had a big effect. And box design that minimized social contact with other horses, they were much more likely to have abnormal behavior. And the other interesting finding, which is relevant to what David will be talking later on gastric ulcers, is that horses that had abnormal behavior were 5 times more likely to have ulcers. So let's look at this again then. So we would like to have lots of forage available. We would try and possibly have them on straw if we could, but I'm going to go into that in a bit more detail later. We would try and allow some social contact, and then hopefully we won't have such a big problem with gastric ulcers. And then another study looked at 10 thoroughbred weavers, 86% reduction when they were offered nose-to-nose social contact. So they were actually able to touch each other. But interestingly, when a mirror was provided, there was almost an equivalent reduction. So social contact, very easy to arrange, grills between stables. I quite like this when they can sort of talk over the top, but the horses feel safe on either side. And all these different which are called talk holes, which I think is a brilliant name. Here, the owner has taken out some of the partition. Similar here, and once again here, they've made an opening between the 2 stables. So the horses can still feel safe, but they can still communicate, they can see each other. And there's a phenomenon which is noticed in herd animals, which is called social facilitation, and that is the tendency of herd animals to do the same thing at the same time. So they all sleep at the same time, they all graze at the same time. And these are 2 of my ponies, and I have basically, this is actually a grill between them, and I've set it up so they can both eat hay from the same place at the same time. So I have deliberately set this up to promote social facilitation in this group. So they sort of, right, let's all eat hay together, and they can see each other, and they can do that. Now, mirrors are quite interesting. The evidence is that the horse perceives the image to be a stranger. And we can say that because very often they will show marked aggression to it. And that's why mirrors should never be sighted near where the horse would be eating, tarred feed, for example. They can cause dramatic reduction in weaving. And the reasons that have been suggested why mirrors work is that they kind of mimic some sort of visual contact. They're very good for separation anxiety. You've got 2 horses and you ride one and the other one can't be ridden. A mirror is a very simple and cheap way. You can get acrylic mirrors now. There's virtually unbreakable, and you can get all different sizes. And there is a thought that maybe they reduce the perception of confinement because the horse, in a sense, sees a bigger space. And here's a video which somebody very kindly owned me. Now, this horse has never seen this mirror before. He's not quite sure. Got his ears pricked. He's wondering who that horse is. Actually, it's a mare, actually. And Andy, if you're watching tonight, thank you very much for lending me your video. So there she is. She sort of turns away and then comes back to have another look. Who's that horse? So I think mirrors are very underutilized, and I think if you can't set up a system whereby the horses can talk through the partition, I would definitely be looking at it. Okay, so changing the subject, there's been a bit of a revolution in how much bedding we've used in the last sort of 20 odd years, because rubber mats became popular about 20 years ago, and now they're pretty much universal. And because people aren't worried about horses getting down on bare concrete, people tend to use much less bedding. So this is the traditional lovely deep straw bed, probably a foot deep or more. And then this is the kind of more modern arrangement that I see a lot, small amount of bedding sort of in the corner of the stable. The horse can urinate on it, and if it lies down, it's probably just about big enough. And this is very, very common, and the bedding is cheap. It's very quick and easy to muck out. So, this is a very common thing. But I read an article, and somebody sort of casually mentioned that horses bedded on straw sleep on their sides 3 times longer than horses bedded on shavings. And I kind of read this and I thought, hang on a minute. For a horse to get true REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, they pretty much need to lie on their side. So if I have a horse on shavings, could it be sleep deprived? Could sleep deprivation be an issue in horses that we haven't really realized? Because when we shut the door at night, we have no idea in the majority of cases what their night is like, or kind of how much sleep they had, whether it was disturbed. So I wrote a Facebook post, which sort of went a bit viral, really, and it basically was, is your horse getting enough sleep? Does it matter? And it went all over the place, 600 shares. So let's have a little look at sleeping behavior. I've got an infrared camera in my folding box, which allows me to look in the dark. I'll warn you that if you buy one of those, they become pretty addictive, and you can't help looking at all times of the day and night what your horses are doing, particularly in the dark. These are 2 weaned foals having a nice little sleep. So on average, a horse has a relatively short period of sleep in comparison with us, about 3 hours per day, but then it kind of stands there with its head low, gently rocking for about another 3 hours in a kind of a drowsy state. And they move from one state to another. So and then at some point in the night, they will have REM sleep, which is normally lying on their side. Occasionally it's sitting up like this one, leaning against the side. So he almost certainly is in REM sleep. And they tend to have fairly short bouts, 4 to 5 sleep periods. And in between times they get up and they eat. And that's what we would expect to happen. So how important is sleep? Well, we know it's certainly in people, it's very important for memory consolidations, or in other words, experiences we have during the day are sort of copper fastened in our brains at night. And if you look at the effect of sleep deprivation on people, we get anxiety, irritability, difficulty in concentration. Are these things we could see in our horses because they're not getting enough sleep, because we've given them that postage stamp on the bed? And we know that human athletes are told it's very important they have lots of good sleep. And if they're sleep deprived, they make more errors, they get a slower reaction time, more injury, less effective immune system, and reduced athletic performance. Now, so what research has been done on this has found several interesting things. First is, and I've mentioned this already, a horse that's sleeping on straw is far more likely to lie on its side for longer than a horse that's on shavings. And experiments have been done using treadmill exercise horses and shown that they do actually sleep more. So if your horse has had a hard day or you've done some heavy exercise, he will sleep more that night. Horses kept in isolation sleep for shorter periods of time, probably because they feel unsafe. And 2 critical observations were the larger the bedded area, the more time the horse spent lying. So in other words, that little postage stamp bedding I showed you earlier could significantly affect how long that horse is going to be lying. And also the deeper the bed, the more sleep. And there was one experiment where they allowed horses to choose what bedding would they prefer to lie on, and they all chose shavings. So the conclusion must therefore be, if you want your horse to have good sleep, it needs more bedding in a bigger area. And this is a little experiment just to finish off on sleep that was done in Aberystwyth University last year. And basically they compared 2 it was straw-bedded stables. They compared a 15 centimetre bed, which is 6 inches, to a 5 centimetre bed, which is 2 inches. And they looked at various things, including how much time the horses spent lying on their side in REM sleep. And you could show here on this graph that if you gave them a deep bed in comparison with a shallow bed, they spent significantly more time asleep on their side. And then if you turned the light on and left the light on, they slept even less. So the conclusion is that give the horse a deeper bed and don't leave the light on. And just to finish off on sleep, here's a horse doing a dressage test at Badminton. The following day, it will be doing the cross country, and I have no doubt the rider will go to bed early and get a really good night's sleep. The horse will be put in one of the Badminton stables. And here are the grooms outside getting them ready. The rider will make sure he or she has a really good sleep that night. What about the horse? Should we really be making a serious effort to ensure that we do everything possible to make this horse have a good night's sleep? It's just a thought I'll just throw out there. Okay, so let's move on to a little bit about eating. I showed you this graph before. 60% of normal horse's life is pretty much spent eating. And that's for that reason we recommend feeding fiber ad lib for behavioral reasons, to prevent gastric ulcers, for all kinds of reasons. The problem is, what do you do with a horse that's on restricted fiber for weight control? And unfortunately, as you know, obesity in horses has reached a sort of epidemic in Britain. And there was an interesting experiment where they gave horses 6 kilograms of hay, which is sort of a biggish net, at 4:30 in the afternoon. And they used different sorts of nets. So this is a double net. It's called a limit net. You can buy them on eBay, they're really cheap. And they looked at how long did they spend eating each kilogram of hay. And there was a huge increase when they went from a single to a double or a triple. There wasn't a huge difference between double and triple. Now that meant that they spent a lot longer eating. So if you then looked at the time they finished the net, the single net they finished at 20 to 2 in the morning, 3 o'clock for the double net, triple net, 5 a.m. So those horses were basically able to eat and continue to eat from 4:30 until 5 in the morning, obviously interspersed with sleep. So the conclusion must be that if your horse is on restricted hay, well then delay intake. And there is evidence that horses adapt to small hole nets, and experiments where they have measured intake over maybe the first 2 days showed a dramatic effect. And when they remeasured it after a week, they found that usually ponies had actually adapted to the small hole nets and were able to feed almost as fast as they were feeding from conventional nets. So my advice now is to go for maybe a double net or even a triple net if you want to slow it down. Just one caution, we don't know yet what effect this is going to have on wear of the incisor teeth. And I'm just showing this picture. This is a horse that's had a green guard muzzle, which you know they're quite hard plastic muzzles. And you can see how much wear of its incisors here, simply by contact with the muzzle. Now, we don't know to what extent horses pulling from a double or a triple net could wear their incisors, and we're going to need to keep an eye on. But when I saw this, I thought, gosh, that's a bit scary. I didn't realize these hard muzzles could cause that. And in fact, the owner now has changed onto a much softer muzzle. Now, it's conventional to dampen feed. This is just a kind of a little aside. And we do it because it reduces waste. If the horse has got bad teeth, it makes it much easier to chew. It reduces the risk of choke. And there are undoubtedly some horses that, unless their feed is damp, they will get choked. They're not very common, but they do occur. It obviously reduces the dust while the horse is feeding. And if you put any medication or electrolytes into the feed, make sure it sticks to the feed so the horse can eat it. However, it does shorten eating time. And I've done some experiments with my own ponies, giving them chaff and time them how long it took to eat a scoop dry or a scoop fed wet. And I found there's a significant difference, roughly about 20%. Now, what does that mean? Well, first of all, if they are feeding wet feed and eating it fairly quickly and swallowing it fairly quickly, it could mean that they're actually producing less saliva, less attrition of the food particles themselves by grinding against the teeth because they're being chewed for a shorter period of time. Saliva is really important. It kickstarts digestion. It contains amylase, which helps the horses digest starch. It also contains bicarbonate, which is a buffer. So I think this, I question clients, well, why do you dampen the feed? And they say, well, aren't you supposed to? Well, I'm not so sure. And all I would say in passing is that I don't dampen my feed anymore, unless there's a specific reason in a specific horse. But in general, I feed it dry. And we don't worry about feeding hay dry, do we? But somehow we decide we must dampen the hard feed. So anyway, I'm just throwing that out as an idea. Now, I don't want to sneak into David's territory on gastric ulcers. I just want to make a point about sugar beet. Pectin supplementation is known to be one of the few supplements which is known to protect against gastric ulceration, and the main source of pectin for horses in this country would be sugar beet. And the problem is people don't feed enough. And this is a scoop of soaked sugar beet. Not much water was used, but it's fully soaked. But actually, if you look how little sugar beet created this apparently large scoop. And this is what I see in yards every day, this kind of sugar beet soup, which to me provides the horse very little pectin, and is probably just an expensive way of dampening feed. So the take-home message from my point of view, and what I preach to clients, is when you soak sugar beet, soak it for using as little water as you possibly can, such that when you squeeze it, a tiny bit of water comes out. In other words, it is fully soaked, but you do not need this soup. And you can feed up to 2 kilograms a day. That's quite safely to horses. That's the dry weight. So that's just a little aside. Okay, so let's talk about colic in the stabled horse. We know there is a strong correlation between feeding hard feed and the risk of colic. So this is a graph which compares the risk of feeding grass versus the risk of feeding hard feed, depending on the amount of hard feed. Now here, these horses are fed more than 5 kilograms, and the risk against feeding just grass, the risk of colic goes up by a factor of 6. So hard feed is a significant risk factor for horses getting colic. And why do we feed hard feed in the first place? Well, because horses physically cannot eat enough forage to get the calories and protein, vitamins and minerals they need for work. And of course, we use it to provide increased levels of vitamins and minerals for work. It's made to a very specific specification. And feed companies, when they recommend the amount of feed, they make a kind of a guesstimate they're assuming the forage is providing an average amount of calories and protein, vitamins and minerals. But of course, that may not always be correct. So when I said the risk goes up significantly by a factor of 6 when you feed 5 kilograms of hard feed to a horse per day, what exactly is that? How much is that? Well, it's roughly 2 scoops twice a day. Now, that isn't a lot for a horse in full work. That's probably, a third of a bucket, if that. And yet you increase the risk hugely of the horse getting colic. So you could therefore say, well, is there anything else I could feed to provide protein and vitamins and minerals and calories for a horse that's in hard work? And if we take this event horse, which is in hard work and has got quite a high demand for calories and protein, etc. And then we look at things like alfalfa or alfalfa plus oil, and look at this is a measure of the calorie content, it's the energy content. Unfortunately, energy is a word that nutritionists use for when they mean calories. And unfortunately, it's a bad word because owners seem to think it's got something to do with making the horse energetic. It's got absolutely nothing to do with that. It's just how calories are described by nutritionists. So if we look at the average competition mix is about 11 to 13. 13 would be probably racehorse mix, megajoules per kilogram. You could say, well, could we substitute that with something else? How about if we went to alfalfa? Could we get that sort of level? Well, alfalfa with oil certainly will get us there. So if we decide I want to reduce the risk of my top event horse getting colic, I really want to stop feeding him these starchy concentrates with cereal grains and so on. Could I change it to something else? Well, you could change it to alpha plus oil. And now several companies are making this. And it's roughly 6 scoops a day. You would need to add a balancer. And Denji, for example, have made a special balancer to go with their alpha oil. I'm not sure if the other companies have, they probably have. So that's an alternative to feeding conventional hard feed. And then if you increase the number of meals, ideally to 3 or 4 if you can, if it's practical, well, then you should greatly reduce the risk of colic and gastric ulcers. Now, when I ask people, my clients, how much are you feeding your horses? Can you tell me what you're feeding the horse? And they say, well, he has haylage, yeah. I say, fine. And he has this mix, and they showed me the bag, and it's, I don't know, Spillers, something or other, or Saracen, or Tenji, or whatever. And then they kind of go into great detail. He's got this one, and he has half a skip of that, and a quarter skip of that, and a full skip of that. And the haylage is kind of barely discussed, as though it's a kind of or the hay, as though it's a kind of single uniform thing. And it's kind of slightly irrelevant to how we feed the horse. Okay, we feed as much as we can, but we don't worry too much about how nutritious it is. And yet, the nutritional value of hay or haylage can vary hugely depending on the grass species and when it was cut. Now, just to give you an example, this is actually Timothy hay or Timothy grass. So when the head, and it's showing how, as it matures here on the bottom, so the head just showing, the head appears, and then the seeds fall off and it's overripe. This is Timothy hay here with these long seed heads. This is probably was made around here. And you can see there's the nutritional value absolutely crashes as the yield goes up. The protein level falls, the calorie content falls as the yield increases and the grass becomes long. And this would apply to any grass species, ryegrass, whatever. But so a farmer making hay or haylage obviously wants to maximize the yield. He would like to make it slightly later in the year when the weather's better, and if it's going to be hay, it's going to need 4 or 5 dry days. So a lot of hay or haylage is made sort of around here when the nutritional value has gone right down. Whereas if we made it here, we would get a lot more from it, and we would feed it ad lib, and the horse would need far less hard feed. So to sort of generalize, well, I feed haylage, the question I have to ask is, well, what sort of haylage, and when was it made? So this is some very mature Timothy, very high in fiber, probably of relatively low nutritional value. Whereas here's some haylage that's been cut in May, well before the head showing, very nutritious, top class feed, and a horse on that is going to need very little hard feed. So you can't talk about hay and haylage as though they were a kind of a uniform product. It all depends when they were made, what the species of grass were, and that sort of thing. I think we need to pay a lot more attention to the quality of our forage rather than seeing it as just a kind of a filler that's sort of, the horse, it occupies the horse, but the real feed is what we put in the bucket. I think that is probably wrong. Okay, changing the subject completely. This is one of my stables. I came in one morning, very early in the morning, the sun was shining, and I was horrified to see this, because what you can see here is the dust in the air. This is a folding box, I've got straw. And I couldn't believe it when I saw this. Oh my God, is the air really that dusty? Without those rays of sun, I couldn't see any of that dust. It was completely invisible. I wasn't aware that it was there. And here's the same stable with shavings. Now, admittedly, the shavings were only laid about probably half an hour before this picture was taken, but they were so-called dust-extracted shavings. Now, you can't see that normally, except when the sunlight's coming through. So the thing is, when we set our targets for the stabled horse, we talked about socialization, etc., but we also talked about clean air. And so what is in the dust in stables? Well, fungal spores are very important. Here they are here, and house dust mites, house dust mite feces, pollen grains, and a lot of it are fragments of bedding material, and also skin debris from the horse. Now, you could say, well, how significant is that? What does that actually mean? Oh yes, the concentration of dust is essentially an equation. It depends on how quickly it's released, but equally how quickly it's removed. So you can compensate for a high rate of release by improving the ventilation. So let's just have a little look. So why is dust important? Well, if you look at the health and safety executive limits for people working in dusty environments, for example, in carpentry shops, where there is softwood dust, the 8-hour exposure limit is 5 milligrams per cubic meter. And yet, if you looked at what's been measured in a lot of conventional stables, irrespective of the bedding, is much higher than that, 3 times, 2 or 3 times. And yet these horses are not in there for 8 hours. They could be in there for 22 hours. And the most important thing is the dust in the breathing zone. And the breathing zone is around the horse's nose. So if and that can be 20 times what it is in the stable air. So why is it important? Well, dust is an irritant for the respiratory system, and most surveys have shown that 60% of stabled horses have got inflamed airways due to exposure to dust. Now, some of them obviously have got a true allergy, which we now call equine asthma, but quite a lot of them just have a lot of mucus in there, and that is interfering with their gas exchange. Their lungs are inflamed. They may not cough, they probably don't cough, and they probably don't have a nasal discharge, but it's there. And when I was team vet for the young rider team, we had 12 horses on the long list, very fit, athletic horses, and I scoped all of them, and 60% of them had a lot of muck in their airways. And when we questioned the owner, basically it was because they had a bad environment. So let's have a look at dust levels. So if we change from hay to haylage, it drops hugely. Dust extracted shavings has a big effect. Cardboard's very good. But mucking out generates a cloud of dust in the stable. And for that reason, really you should muck out with the horse out of the stable and leave it out for as long as you possibly can. And if we buy these lovely clean shavings, but if we start deep littering them, we get the dust level increases hugely. Here, straw is variable, and interestingly, although shredded paper has got a very low dust level, if we start deep littering it, which most people do, it can greatly increase. So the conclusion from this really is, by all means, use shavings, but keep them clean and don't deep litter. And remember, the fungi are everywhere. This is my trailer. I was a bit lazy after a show on a Saturday and didn't bother mucking it out. And when I went in there on Wednesday, here were all these fungi proliferating on fresh feces. So they're everywhere, and they love horse feces. So any kind of fecal hay contamination, moisture they like, non-disturbed areas. These are some lovely toadstools growing on my mucky. So if you want to reduce fungal multiplication, don't deep litter, add fresh bedding regularly, and keep the contamination by droppings and forage as low as possible. So in other words, ideally you shouldn't have a bedded area directly under where the hay or haylage is. You want to be able to keep that clean, and no banks. Now, I'm getting to the end now, close to the end. This picture appeared on Facebook. Somebody shared it from a veterinary practice in the north of England. And the kind of comment that was made with it was, this horse belongs to a vet, and said, even vets' horses get cast. And I saw that and I thought, hold on a minute. This horse has got some pretty big banks around there. I thought they're supposed to stop horses getting cast. And I've been against banks for a while because people concentrate on keeping this area here with lovely fresh bed, but they kind of leave the banks. And if I put my hand into the bottom of the bank and pull out some bedding and smell it, generally I can, it smells really moldy. So people forget about this. And anyway, so I kind of slightly challenged this idea. And I wrote a Facebook post, do bedding bans prevent horse getting cast? It went absolutely crazy. Even Horse and Hound actually started quoting it. I had a phone call from a Dutch horse magazine because this is deeply rooted in the folklore that we must give them banks, but I seriously question that. And I didn't read all 1,100 comments. I think I stopped reading at about 700. And I think unless the bedding in the banks is kept as fresh as the bedding in the center, you are inevitably going to get fungal multiplication there. So there's no point concentrating on what's happening here when you ignore what's around there. So what's the alternative then? If you're going to, if you want to stop getting cast, well then this is an anti-cast rail here. This is a yard we go to. All the stables have got this wooden batten around the edge. This one's even got 2 of them. And here you can buy a commercial one. I can't remember the name of the company that supplies the rubber one. If you want to stop horses being cast. So I don't have any banks. And what I do is I pull the bedding in from the sides all the time into the center. So it's as fresh on the edge as it is in the center. Other way, of course, is to soak hay. Haylage is better, I think, because it means there's no hay on the premises and nobody's going to accidentally feed a horse a dry hay net or one day when you're in a hurry. Experimentally, when horses with asthma were challenged with a single challenge with hay dust, and then turned out in the field, they took a month to come right. So I think if you've got a horse with asthma, my advice to you is to go to Haylage. These are different steaming systems. We've got the hay game one, which costs about as much as a car. This is a kind of a homemade one, steaming easy, and this is a real homemade one with them. So you can steam the hay. One point to make about steaming is it does not reduce the calorie content. So it does not take the sugar out. You can, of course, improve ventilation other ways by leaving the door open. These are all different sort of windows, systems. This one drops down. A simple way is just take the glass out. And if you're worried about your horse being cold, just put another rug on. Don't restrict ventilation to keep horses warm. And if you have a stable like this, the simple solution is get this flat bit here and just drill holes all along the back. You won't have any drafts because they're relatively small, and straight away you can improve the airflow through the stable. Yorkshire boarding, space boarding here is very useful. The gaps should be the same thickness as the boards. Okay, and then just to finish off, if you go home in the evening and your partner or your husband or your wife says to you, God, you absolutely stink of horses, what they're probably smelling actually is probably ammonia on your clothes from urine. And one problem with this rubber mat system and minimal bedding, I have noticed, is that the ammonia levels in stables has become a real problem. And ammonia is an irritant for the horse's respiratory system. I wrote this one, doesn't matter if my stables smell of urine, and that got over 250,000 views. It's becoming a more common problem. A horse produces 15 litres of urine, which is roughly equivalent to a full bucket. And then it lands on the ground and the urea is converted by bacteria in the stable floor into ammonia, which then comes into the stable air. If we look at what is recommended for people working in high ammonia environments, and that would be, for example, pig farms, the work exposure limit they recommend for 8 hours is 25 parts per million. If you can smell it, it's very variable between people. Some people can smell it at a very low level, but quite a few studies have shown that the levels in some stables can be as high as 250 parts per million. So if there's a strong smell of urine in your stables, it's very likely that the ammonia level is way above what is acceptable for humans. And we know it causes excess airway inflammation and excess mucus. Rubber mats are great, but when they start retracting, as here, this is 2 of my stables. Unfortunately, I haven't got a comparable. 2005, we laid the mats. 2017, gaps have started to appear. And of course, urine gets down in there and then you get some ammonia production. It's impossible to keep it clear. So what can you do? Well, improve ventilation, put in more bedding, more absorbent bedding, muck out more frequently. You can use a stable disinfectant. Remember that it should be a true disinfectant, not just a deodorizer, which some of them are. Try and seal between the mats. And the other thing is teach the horse to urinate in command. It's relatively easy to do. I've trained quite a few of them. And then you can just catch it in the pooper scooper and it doesn't go in the bed and you can reduce the ammonia level. The other thing I've used as one of my stables is a garden lime. If you just get a sort of a cup full of that and scatter it on the urine footprint, that will have a dramatic effect on the ammonia level in stables, and then you can just pull the bed on top of that. And it also dries the floor quite nicely, and it's a really good thing to do. So we've been through all of these things, stable vices. We've talked about the importance of social interaction. We've talked about clean air. We've talked about issues relating to gastric ulceration. And we've talked about the link between feeding and housing and colic. And we've talked about all these things that cause stress and anxiety. So I hope you've got some ideas from my talk this evening, and maybe you will put some of them into action maybe. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end using the chat box. And this is a wonderful expression which recently has come out in relation to horses, and it's called the 3 Fs: friends, social contact, fiber, availability of forage all the time as much as you can, and freedom is essentially as much turnout as you can possibly do.
Great. Thank you very much, Kieran, for that super overview of the stabled horse. I think we all, I hope you all gained something there and can reflect on the way that we're stabling horses. I'm going to take the story on a little bit further. Kieran touched on gastric ulceration and how stabling a horse can predispose this condition. And I'm going to focus more on this. For those of you I haven't met, I'm David Rowlands. I'm one of the clinical directors at Penbode Equine Vets. I've been with the practice for the last 16 years, although I've actually been around the practice well, all of my life actually, because my father and other relatives have worked at the practice before me. But I will now go on to focus on, as I say, gastric ulceration. Okay, right. Well, there are many clinical signs that have been identified to have been associated with gastric ulceration. I'm sure we're all familiar with the picky feeder, the poor doer, the horse that's losing weight. This is a fairly classical image at the bottom here. There are also multiple other signs that we see. Any sign of poor behavior or resistance or poor performance may be associated with gastric ulceration. And the 2 images at the top here, these are images that we're seeing more and more frequently. One is the girthing issue, when we tighten a horse's girth, and I have a video clip in a minute of a horse putting its ears back and swishing its tail. And this is a really interesting one, the brushing of the horse's flanks and the touching of the horse's flanks. I've had several horses present like this and have some quite nasty glandular ulcers. And we think that the rationale behind this is because the nerve supply to the horse's skin in the flank area actually joins into the spinal cord in a very similar place, adjacent to where the nerves which innervate the stomach. And actually, when there is the brushing, the horse actually associates the brushing of the skin with its stomach pain. Kieran mentioned some stereotypical behavior. We saw Kieran mentioning windsuckers and crib biters, and these have been long associated with gastric ulceration, as has colic as well. So we have a short video clip here, as I was mentioning before, of a horse which is being girthed up, being tightened up, and there we have the tail swishing, the ears back, and this is a fairly classical sign of gastric ulceration. Okay, so here we have a schematic diagram of the horse's alimentary tract. This is the stomach in the middle of the horse. And it's interesting, look where the stomach is in relation to the saddle, where the rider will be, and the girth coming around over there. The stomach is a relatively small part of the horse's alimentary tract. It's only about 7% of the actual volume of the whole gastrointestinal tract. So it's a relatively small part. And the horses are actually referred to as monogastric hindgut fermenters, which basically means they have one stomach chamber, unlike ruminants like cattle and sheep that have four. And so that's the monogastric, and hindgut fermenter, because most of the digestion actually happens further back in the intestines. And the nearest other animal, or the animal which has the nearest alimentary tract to this, is the rabbit. That's another hindgut fermenter. So if we start the sort of journey of food, food is prehended by the incisor teeth. It's chewed and masticated by these cheek teeth, where saliva is mixed in with the food, which starts the digestion process of starch. A horse produces about 10 to 12 liters of saliva a day, and it's very, very important because it has an alkaline pH, which actually helps to neutralize stomach acid. So the horse, after it's chewed the food, this then passes down the esophagus, and when the esophagus there is here is 1.5 meters or 1.25 meters to 1.5 meters in length. And this junction here is called the cardia, or the cardiac sphincter. And this is very tight normally, which is the reason why horses don't usually or can't vomit, because that cardia is so tight. The stomach is a relatively small structure, as I said, varies from about 8 to 16 liters in size. And it has two distinct layers. The top layer is a squamous epithelium, which does not produce gastric acid and has no protection from gastric acid. And the lower 2/3 are glandular, and they produce hydrochloric acid, gastric acid, and also something mucus, which protects the lining. So once after food has been partially digested in the stomach, it then passes out through the pylorus. You're going to see lots of images of this shortly, but this is the pylorus here, which leads into the duodenum, and then the jejunum and the ileum, which is the small intestine. And this is 21 meters in length in total. And this is where a lot of the digestion occurs. This is the vast majority of digestion occurs in the small intestine, and then it passes into the large intestine, which entails the cecum, where cellulose is broken down, a lot of roughage is broken down, and also water and electrolytes are absorbed, and then eventually feces are passed out in the rectum. So equine gastric ulcer syndrome, that phrase was first used way back in 1999, and horses, we first diagnosed gastric ulcers and were treating gastric ulcers at Penbode in 2005. And this was about the time when gastric ulcer syndrome was really beginning to hit the press, and people were beginning to be aware of it in this country. It had been kind of researched and been first become aware in America. This guy here in the photograph here is Richard Hepburn. He's a college friend of mine. We were at university together, and he was one of the first people in this country to be scoping horses, and he actually gastroscoped looking for ulcers at Penbode back in 2005. This other chap here, this is a guy called Tim Brazil, who's another leading gastroscoper in the country, and I've worked a lot with Tim here at Penbode as well. This photograph actually is taken at a para dressage Paralympic dressage squad training session at Stow and the Wold. For 10 years, I was one of the team vets with British Para Dressage and British Dressage, and we used to regularly scope horses at training sessions to monitor their gastric health, and to make sure that we could optimize them, because there is a link between gastric health and performance. So we do now have our own scope at Penbode, and having worked for many years alongside Richard and Tim when they've been scoping at Penbode and as I say at Para Dressage squad sessions, Hermione, Jane, the other clinical director here at Penbode, and I are regularly scoping horses with our own gastroscope. Speaking of the devil, here is our gastroscope, and you can see that this is, it looks like I'm holding up a big python or a big snake, doesn't it? It's 3.5 meters long, this scope, and it has to be in order to be passed up the nose, down the esophagus, and into the stomach. And we get an image on the screen here. And if I come over here, this is an image which was taken of a national hunt thoroughbred racehorse that we scoped last week. And you can see on the screen here that there are these two layers that I alluded to, and I'm going to keep coming back to in this talk, where this whitish layer at the top is the squamous epithelium, no glands and unprotected from acid. And you can see these pinkish little dots, these pinkish lesions here, which are stomach ulcers, and they would be, I'm going to come on to a grading system, but they would be probably a grade 2 stomach ulcer. And then there's this line here, which is called the margo plicatus, and then the pink area beneath is glandular mucosa, and you can see these reddish lesions here. These were pretty severe ulcers, really, or very blatant ulcers. As I say, this was taken last week in COVID times, so I'm afraid we're all masked up with PPE, keeping as socially distanced as we possibly can. Our team at Penbode are being very conscious to not be spending any more time in the same airspace as we have to, but for certain procedures, it is teamwork, and gastroscopy is an example of that. I'm here driving the gastroscope, looking at the image on the screen. Meg here is passing the scope up the nose, and Charlie here is helping us with the horse and just with using the machine as well. This horse has been given some light sedation, and the horse has had no food for 8 hours prior to the scoping, and within an hour or so after the scoping, it really is back to normal. It's a very, very routinely done and well tolerated procedure. So this is a video clip of my fellow clinical director here in the equine department at Penbode. This is Hermione Jane using our gastroscope down at our Lamerton clinic. And you can see on the screen there, you can see that that white squamous epithelium at the top here, the margo plicatus, and then if you follow where my pointer's going, then there's the pink structure of the glandular epithelium underneath. Over here you can see our assistant here just passing the scope. Hermione's talking to her, the sound is switched off, they're communicating, and Emily here is just passing the scope to get it to help Hermione get to exactly the right spot. If you notice here where Hermione's pointing, this is actually, the scope has gone all the way around the stomach, and you can see where the scope is coming in to the in through the cardia, and Hermione is now aiming down at an area called the lesser curvature, where she's about to dip down, and I think you'll see her gesticulating that she's about to dip down into there, and then follow underneath the antrum into looking for the pylorus, which is the outlet of the stomach. So I'll just show you now. Hermione's moved the scope on, and you're about to see a little the pylorus here, which is the outlet of the stomach. It's this hole here. There you go. That is the very end of the stomach, going out into, before it goes into the intestine. And as I say, Hermione and Emily are talking to each other and just guiding the scope to get it to exactly the right spot. So gastric ulcer disease, actually, we now know that there are two distinct diseases. They are not the same disease, although they are often there at the same time. There's equine squamous gastric disease and equine glandular gastric disease. That the glandular surface and the squamous surface are two entirely different materials and with two entirely different diseases. Squamous disease can either be a primary or secondary in origin. Primary is by far the most common. Primary basically is due to an overproduction of acid. Secondary is due to an obstruction to the outflow of the acid. Gastric glandular disease is a very different condition. It is often inflammatory in origin, and we describe it according to its location and its severity. And there are some long words here. Antrum, pylorus, cardia, and fundus are parts of the stomach, which we describe where it's from. And these other words here really just describe how the lesion looks. So this is a horse's stomach, which has been cut open. It actually looks very much like the stomach of a rat, significantly bigger, but the same structure, with this top third being the squamous, the margo plicatus, and then the lower 2/3 being glandular. The pig stomach is a little bit the same. There's a little bit of squamous at the top of a pig stomach, but the rat stomach is the nearest we have to this. So this is the cardia, which leads into the esophagus and where the scope comes in. This was the lesser curvature, where Hermione dipped the scope down and came up and then focused on this pylorus here before it goes into the small intestine. So you can see here that there are some high figures of ulcers occurring in racehorses in training, in sport horses, and in leisure horses. And glandular ulcers are also very, very common. We do see them a lot in thoroughbreds, but you'll notice they are very prevalent in sport horses. And we do see a lot of these glandular ulcers in the population of horses that we work with. Okay, so equine squamous disease, as I alluded to earlier, it's graded on a 0 to 4 scale. 0 here, this is a normal looking epithelium. Once we get, there's just a faint amount of reddening coming through on a grade 1. By grade 2, you've got very, very obvious red focal ulcers coming through here. And then grade 3 and grade 4 are getting much more severe. So equine gastric glandular disease, affects this lower part here. And as I said earlier, there's no grading system as such other than just describing the lesion. So this is the pylorus, which I was talking about earlier, which Hermione focused on. And you can see here this reddening here around the pylorus. And we would describe those ulcers as being moderate, raised, multifocal, erythematous pyloric lesions. Quite a mouthful. Erythematous means reddening, but basically you can see the reddening here. And this is the area that Hermione dipped down into. It looks like a tunnel. You can see that this is the cardia, where the scope comes into the stomach, which is just here. So the scope comes in, it goes all the way around the outside of the scope, and it comes, because this will obviously be circular, it comes back to this point, and then just when you come back to this point, you dip down into here, follow through, and eventually you splash through these this gastric content, and then you come up and you see the pylorus there. Okay, so These are the signs which I showed some photographs of earlier, and the glandular disease here is what we're seeing more and more in sport horses and leisure horses. You can see that they can be temperament changes. Horses might be nervous or aggressive. If a rider is finding that the horse is just changing in its rideability, the horse just isn't going as well as it used to go, that might be a sign of, if there's a change, the change is the word to look out for. If a horse was once a good doer who did well and now it isn't, then that change may be a factor that suggests gastric ulceration. Unexplained weight loss, reduced appetite, as I mentioned earlier, this girthing or not liking leg aids, grooming, these are really common. Colic is less common. It does happen, but it is associated, but it happens less often. These signs over here on the left are not usually associated with the glandular gastric disease, but we do see them associated with squamous gastric disease, which is the coat changes, crib biting, wind sucking, and you do occasionally get horses that grind their teeth, and on rare occasions diarrhea. These certainly diarrhea and colic are not common associations in the adult horse. Something that we do see commonly is a bit of a syndrome, really, where a horse is presented with suspect back pain, and something that we do spend with our poor performance workups is trying to identify whether a horse has genuine back pain or whether it's stomach pain. It really is, I mean, I personally refer to it as core pain because it's difficult to know, it really is, whether it's the horse's back or the horse's stomach. Up here on the right, up here, this is the pylorus. You'll be getting used to seeing images of the pylorus now. This is probably one of the worst pyloric hemorrhagic ulcers that I've experienced at Penbode. And this horse was from an advanced dressage horse that came into the practice with an owner reporting that they thought the horse had a sore back. Actually, we worked the horse up and we scoped the stomach, and we actually found that it had hemorrhagic gastric ulcers, which it had treatment for and has significantly improved from this situation now. The image, the x-rays at the bottom here show dorsal spinous processes, which are these spines coming out the top of a horse's back. And these are kissing spines where you've got remodeling of the bone between the vertebrae. And here we have, these are the articular facet joints at the base of the dorsal spinous processes. And these can be associated with back pain. So as I say, is it back pain? Is it gastric disease? We spend a significant proportion of our poor performance workup time differentiating between the two. Okay, so the horse's stomach in a schematic diagram. A little bit of repetition here, but it's a really key point. At the top part of the stomach, the normal empty stomach, or a normal stomach anyway, you have a glandular, this is non-glandular, there's no acid and there's no protective layer. The bottom part is glandular. This is where hydrochloric acid is secreted and where mucus is produced. There's naturally a protective lining, and then there's a mucus lining which is produced, which makes further protects this layer. Now, in an empty stomach, when you get hydrochloric acid produced at the bottom here in the glandular area, this area, particularly when a horse moves, and anything faster than a walk can make an empty stomach prone to ulcers, that you get the acid splashing up, and there's no protection in this area, and so you get these ulcers. Some people refer to them as splash ulcers in the top part. Now, when a horse eats roughage, Kieran Kieran told us all about the importance of good quality fiber and of roughage, and it really is so important for a horse, particularly with the protection from gastric ulcers. Roughage is, as I say, chewed in the mouth. It mixes with saliva. Saliva has an alkaline pH, and then when it comes down through the down the esophagus into the stomach, it forms this fibrous mat. and it forms a physical barrier, but it's also, because it's soaked in saliva, which is alkaline, it actually starts to neutralize the acid as well. And so the chance of these splash lesions occurring in a stomach which is full and which it has plenty of fiber in it is very much a protective measure for the horse. So equine squamous gastric disease, this top layer here, is caused by exposure of this area to acid. It can be made, this lower area, the acidity can be increased by high concentrate diets, particularly pelleted diets as opposed to mixes. Also, as I said before, you get increased intra-abdominal pressure at gaits greater than walk. So when a horse is trotting or cantering, acid is pushed up from this layer and can cause damage to this layer. There's also increased severity with the length of time that a horse is in training. So gastric glandular disease is slightly different. Basically, what happens is you've normally got a protective layer down here, but at times of stress or at times of exercise or due to high concentrate feeding, you can actually get a reduction in the blood supply to this layer, which can lead to hypoxia, reduced oxygen levels, and it makes this level prone to erosions and ulcerations, and at times you can get inflammatory lesions there as well. So in humans, this lesion, the glandular area, has been associated with a bacteria called Helicobacter pylori. We don't think that is the case in horses, and in humans, it's well known that if you take anti-inflammatory drugs, drugs in the family is things like paracetamol, aspirin for prolonged periods of time, Nurofen, that can make you prone to getting glandular ulcers. In horses, that potentially can happen. However, it would require you to be on things like bute for 2 weeks or so, at somewhere between 2 to 6 times the recommended dose. So in the adult horse, we don't think that routine short-term bute treatment is a common cause of gastric ulceration. So we see the squamous disease at the top in the racing breeds. So in this country, primarily thoroughbreds. In other countries where the standard bred trotter is a common racehorse, then they also appear to have a breed predisposition. And the intensity and duration of exercise, the longer we work horses for, the more likely they are to have these ulcers. Yard location is a factor too. I worked for a couple of years in racehorse practice and stud practice in Newmarket, in Suffolk, and that very much was an urban area. Those horses in training while they're in training, would be basically stabled and would have very, very little, if any, access to turnout, as opposed to horses that I'm working with now that are in training in basically farm situations, which is a far more natural environment for horses to be in. And as it's 3.9, nearly 4 times more likely for a horse in an urban situation to develop squamous ulceration than it is in a more rural environment. Kieran showed some great images of horses stabled and having windows and being able to communicate and having mirrors and seeing each other. And that is a great way of preventing or reducing the chance of gastric ulcers, because a lack of direct contact with other horses is a definite risk factor, as are solid barriers. So windows between them, bars between them, just being able to see other horses is really important. And horses don't like talk radio. Horses like music. So I'm afraid turn off Jeremy Vine and switch over to Classic FM or Pirate FM or somewhere where they're playing some music, and that too is will reduce the chance of squamous ulcers. There are nutritional factors, not surprisingly. As reduced pasture turnout will increase squamous ulcers. Turning out with other horses will reduce ulcers. You know, horses like company, as Kieran was saying. Straw as the only forage is a risk factor. Now, this doesn't happen too much in this country, but certainly in certain parts of Northern Europe, feeding straw alone as a form of forage is not uncommon, and this is a risk factor. Also, Kieran mentioned about the frequency of feeding, and totally agree that we ideally do not want horses to be going longer than 6 hours between forage meals, and using things like those multiple hay nets can slow down the eating slow down horses eating. There is some emerging work coming out at the moment which is showing that the amount of gastric acid produced at night is slightly less than during the day. And there is an argument which is being put forward. I'm not sure that there is a lot of science behind it at the moment, but there is a rationale which may be more and more substantiated, that actually feeding horses slightly more forage during the day than during the night may be the way forward. And you will see this becoming discussed more and more, and well, we'll wait and see how the sort of science backing it up or develops. So non-exercising animals stabled and fed grain an hour before hay is a risk factor, as is high starch intakes. If starch intake during the day is increased greater than 2 grams per kilogram body weight, this increases the chance of grade 2 or more ulcers. And intermittent access to water. Always make sure your horse has access to water. That will reduce the chances of squamous ulcers. Onto the gastric glandular disease. This is more a condition of performance horses, of sport horses, although we do see it in the racehorse. The first slide I showed was a National Hunt Thoroughbred racehorse, a young horse just beginning to have the pressure put on, who did have glandular ulcers. But we see this much more in the warm bloods, the show jumpers, dressage horses, eventers. In an ideal world, we advise, and it has been shown, that riding a horse no more than 4 to 5 days a week will reduce the chance of gastric glandular disease. So rest days are important. It does increase during the competition season, and the more stress and pressure that is put on a horse, there is an increased chance of gastric glandular disease. And then the increased number of people, the more people looking after a horse, and the more inconsistency in the daily management of the horse, there is an increased chance. So in a busy yard with lots of people moving about, lots of hubbub, that is an increased chance. Whereas if you keep your horse on a relatively small yard where there might only be 1 or 2 people, and it's the same people looking after the horse, this actually does reduce the chance of gastric ulceration. I mentioned before anti-inflammatory drugs potentially could cause gastric ulceration, but you'd need to be giving them for a prolonged period of time at 2 to 6 times the standard dose, which, to be honest with you, we as a practice don't prescribe drugs at that dose. So I think the chance is extremely low. Orthopedic disease, sort of lameness and back pain, may be associated with glandular disease, although, to be honest with you, we see so much back pain and so much lameness in our workload. It may just be that they are both quite common conditions. There's a predisposition for these conditions in these breeds, as there is gastric ulceration. So it may just be that the two diseases happen to be there at the same time. So in order to reduce gastric glandular disease, we want to have at least 2 days a week rest, turn out where possible. Although, as Kieran alluded to, actually having a bit of a free system where horses can actually choose where they want to be, so they can actually be outside or in their stable, is a very good and stress-free system. Certainly, I've noticed our pony at home has this system of being able to come in and out of the barn whenever she chooses. And it often surprises me when it's lashing down with rain that she's actually choosing to be out in the rain, when you'd naturally have thought that you would bring her into the stable. We want to minimize changes, as we said before, and minimize the changes in equine companions and human carers. Horses like routine. And then this really is a big take-home point, and it's probably the biggest change in feeding, really, in the last 10 or so years, is the fact that that there used to be a teaching, really, that we don't feed within the hour of riding a horse. That certainly was many years ago, when I was in the pony club, the case, is what we were taught. Whereas I know now that actually giving horses 2 litres of chaff 30 minutes prior to exercise will actually lead to forming this, or re-establishing this fiber mat, which will help to neutralize and prevent a barrier and help prevent gastric ulcers. So this really is a key take-home point: 2 litres of chaff 30 minutes prior to exercise. So here we are doing our gastroscopy, which is the diagnosis. It's the only way of definitively diagnosing gastric ulcers. It's a relatively short procedure. We'd be the actual gastroscopy will probably take about 10 or 15 minutes now. We'll have the horse in, make sure he or she is nice and calm. Probably people are in and out of the practice in an hour, and the procedure itself is relatively short and pain-free. There is an adage when it comes to treatment and prevention of ulcers that no acid, no ulcer. This certainly was an adage in human medicine, and I think it really does apply to equine medicine as well. Regardless of the type of ulcer, acid suppression is going to be a key part. So as far as treating these ulcers, omeprazole, many of you will be familiar with omeprazole. Many of you who've had gastric ulcers have probably used omeprazole. Unfortunately, the human preparation of omeprazole is destroyed by horse stomach acid, and so is not really particularly effective. It is a proton pump inhibitor. It reduces hydrochloric acid, and the pastes, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, are actually buffered so that they will actually survive through the horse's stomach, and they are actually absorbed. A lot of people think they act topically. They don't. They pass through the horse's stomach. They're absorbed in the small intestine, and then they function by being absorbed and passing in the bloodstream back to the stomach. The pastes are licensed for squamous disease. Interestingly enough, they're not licensed for glandular disease, but they are effective against glandular disease when used with sucralfate. There is an intramuscular injection form of the omeprazole, which is off license, but we use it by means of the cascade if it's the most appropriate treatment, and that is effective against both squamous and glandular disease. I mentioned sucralfate earlier. This actually protects the mucus, it sticks, it adheres to the ulcers in the mucosa, and it stimulates mucus secretion. It enhances blood flow, so it enhances repair in this area, and it's used, as I said earlier, sucralfate is used in combination with omeprazole. This last treatment, misoprostol, we hardly use at Penbode. We have it in our toolbox, it's in our armory to use. I don't like using it, if I'm honest, because it is actually a prostaglandin. It's used, it can cause abortion in humans, and for that reason I don't like handing it out as a tablet form, but sometimes we have to. Sometimes if we get really stubborn glandular disease which hasn't responded well to these other treatments, we've got misoprostol as a choice. This next slide is a bit frightening, and please don't try to digest it all. I've put it in entirety, really, just to show that we do work to quite a strict regime when it comes to the treatment of gastric ulcers. And there is a flow diagram method here. There are 3 key treatments, either using for glandular disease, omeprazole and sucralfate oral together, the misoprostol, which I said we hardly use at Penbode, but we do use in rare occasions, and then the long-acting injectables. And it doesn't, in theory, matter which of these 3 you start. We would generally probably start with the pastes or the injection. We reassess the horse after 4 weeks. If there's an improvement, then we would stick with that treatment until we get resolution. If there isn't improvement, then we would switch the treatment if necessary. If we are not making progress, then we can biopsy, take a sample, punch biopsy from the surface of the mucosa and analyze it and see if we get any further information about what may be going on. And that may tell us that there is a bacterial infection. This is quite rare, but it does happen. But we will identify that, and we can have to treat with antibiotics and continue with acid suppression. Or there may be inflammation, which needs to have some treatment with some glucocorticoids. As I said, I've just put this in to show that we don't just make it up as we go along. There is quite a strict protocol and a regime that we follow, and we do get some very good results and some good success. So prevention, this is where we want to be. We don't really want to have to be treating ulcers. We want to try and prevent it. And a lot of this comes back to the management in Kieran's lecture about just general stable management, about general stable design, and access to roughage. Those are absolute cornerstones. In addition to that, we want to obviously be reducing the amount of concentrates and grain, and particularly pelleted food. We want to be trying to use, if we have to, the mixes, which are less ulcerogenic. Something else which is useful to add to the feed is oil. There's been a lot of research about using corn oil, and more recently rapeseed oil. A lot of the initial work was done using corn oil because the initial work was done in America, where corn oil is extremely common and extremely cheap. But as I say, I know that corn oil is very much available in this country as well, but out of choice, it's corn oil or rapeseed oil, 45 mils once a day in the feed. People often ask about nutraceuticals or supplements. I try not to talk about individual products as such, but I talk about what's in them. And as Kieran said, Kieran talked about pectin and lecithin and the association with sugar beet. This is very effective for helping to decrease the chance of gastric glandular disease, and is available in certain supplements. And antacids, and this does come with a caveat, are effective against squamous disease and are in certain supplements. The caveat is that antacids are, particularly magnesium hydroxide, is quite short acting in the horse. And so although it is effective, you do have to give quite a lot of it. So it's possibly a little bit disappointing in its effect against squamous disease, whereas I think pectin lecithin is far more predictable against glandular disease. And then also there is the pharmaceutical treatments, and certainly when I was involved with the junior and young rider dressage team, we would be traveling horses to European championships, going from Kent over to France, and on one occasion across to Italy, when you'd be on the road with horses for 3 days. And if there were horses who were prone to gastric ulceration, we would pop them on to some oral omeprazole for the journey. And in fact, during under FEI regulations, oral omeprazole is FEI legal, so you can actually compete horses under National Federation, British Eventing, British Dressage, British Show Jumping, and FEI with the oral omeprazole. Something to bear in mind, those of you who may be into racing, point-to-pointing, national hunt racing, flat racing, there is a detection time for oral omeprazole for racing. So horses have to come off for 48 hours prior to racing. There is just you have to be aware of rules and regulations. So in a nutshell, I showed these images earlier. Look out for these signs in your horse. If your horse is showing these signs, that it may have gastric ulcers. Back pain or gastric pain, as I say, this is the, I enjoy these cases actually. I enjoy working up horses with potentially sore backs or potentially gastric ulcers. And I think the reason I enjoy them is because they're quite challenging, but you see results, and you get horses coming into the practice, or we visit them in the yard, who are not happy in themselves. They are in pain. They are not thriving. And if you can get to the root of the problem, you can really see them moving forward with their ears pricked and actually enjoying their jobs again. So they can affect any horses at all. It's not just a racing disease. Even leisure horses, even just horses that are used for hacking and fun rides, can be prone to this condition. The diagnosis is by means of a gastroscopy. Treatment, as I've mentioned, is often successful, but management and feeding really are cornerstones. Treatment, yes, we can treat them and sort them out, but we have to get to the bottom of the management and the feeding. As I said earlier, 2 days a week of rest, turn out where possible, and then minimize those changes and keep the routine as consistent as possible, and 2 liters of chaff 30 minutes prior to exercise. So I just like to say a big thank you to all of our team at Penbode. Gastroscopy is very much a team. You can't do it by yourself. And Charlie, Meg, Emily, Kieran, Jeremy, everybody at Penbode does their bits in helping out. I'd like to thank Hermione, who you saw in the video, who's is regularly gastroscoping at Penbode, and also to Richard Hepburn and Tim Brazil, who've taught me a tremendous amount while I've been working with them over the last sort of 20 years. Just like to say thank you very much to all of you for listening, and if you've got any more questions, we'll do our best to try and field them. I know that Charlie has been noting all the questions that have come forward, and Kieran and I will be very pleased to try and answer them. Thank you very much.
We've had lots of really excellent questions. We won't have time to cover them all, but I've grouped some of the ones that have come up a couple of times. So first of all, David, for you, we've had some questions about feeding alfalfa. Are they useful to treat the ulcers, or is it more of a preventative measure? And are there any other chaffs which would be suitable as well?
I think alfalfa is probably the forage of choice, really, forage of choice for prevention and for cure, really. That would be certainly the one of choice, although chaff in general and forage of general is very important. So if alfalfa isn't available, then whatever is a good second choice. I don't know if you want to, do you want to add anything to that, Kieran?
Yeah, as you may have gathered from my talk, I'm a great fan of alfalfa. There was some work done, I think, in Germany, which showed that alfalfa chaff increased the risk of ulcers near the pylorus. That work was done in foals, and when it was repeated in adults, they weren't able to show the same effect. So I think the story that alfalfa is bad for ulcers is probably not true. And alfalfa does have some positive benefits. It's high in calcium and protein, both of which have a buffering effect. Also, it's fairly coarse, so it has to be chewed quite a lot, so the horse would produce a lot of saliva. So I think I'm agreeing with David. I think alfalfa for an ulcer-prone horse is great, and also because it's got quite high digestible energy, it can be used to replace a lot of these kind of grain, starchy concentrates. So yes, I'm all for that.
I know there was also some studies done in America about alfalfa hay, whereby, sorry, they found that there was a stark contrast between alfalfa hay and coastal Bermudan hay, which is very common over there as well, which was much less effective at preventing ulcers. But yeah.
Wonderful. Kieran, a question that came up several times during your talk was wood pellets is a fairly new type of bedding. People just wondered if you had any thoughts on sort of air quality and sleep quality when using wood pellets.
I think as far as sleep quality is concerned, I think any deep bed that covers a large part of the stable probably is going to be good for sleep, irrespective of its composition. Wood pellets are highly absorbent, and therefore the urine footprint should be much smaller. So therefore the ammonia level should be a lot less in horses kept on wood pellets. I found myself, I changed to wood pellets and got very excited thinking these are definitely the bee's knees. But I found that they were getting down between the mats and lifting them apart. So I ended up with a whole lot of sawdust effectively between the mats, soaked in urine, which was very difficult to remove. So actually I completely stopped using them for that reason. So have I answered the question, Charlie? Was there something I left out?
Yeah, I just didn't know if there was anything more you wanted to add about
air quality. Sorry, yes, air quality. I don't think we know. All the studies that were done on air quality in stables were done really before pellets came on the scene. I mean, intuitively, you have to think that something that's very finely ground potentially could cause problems with air quality. But remember that air quality is a function of two opposing things. It's the amount of dust released from the bedding, but also the rate at which it's cleared from the stable. So I think if your horse is on wood pellets, i.e. sawdust, you should have good ventilation. I think we get very exercised about bedding when we should equally be thinking about how well ventilated the stable is and make every effort to have a good airflow through the stable. So I would recommend that if you're on, your horse is on pellets, that you should have a really good look at the ventilation in the stable. Just a gap over the half door just is not enough. You should have another inlet as far away from the door as you possibly can get.
Okay, hopefully that's answered some of the wood pellet based questions. David, just back to you. We've had some questions about horses having days off during the week as a measure that might help with ulcers. Do we know, is it better if they're consecutive or spaced out, or does it not really matter? It doesn't really matter.
The fact of the matter is that they can either be adjacent, or they can be just 2 or 3 days during the week off. It's the fact that the stomach really gets a rest from this increased intra-abdominal pressure, and the horse gets downtime and ability just to be a horse and eat forage.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Kieran, we had another question about sugar beet. Does it matter if it's molasses sugar beet or unmolasses sugar beet, and what effect might that have on ulcers?
Yeah, I don't think it makes any difference at all whether it's molasses or unmolasses, as long as you feed enough of it. I mean, clearly, if you have a horse that's also got a weight problem, and you should be using the unmolasses. But I think in terms of whether it's molasses or unmolasses, I don't think it makes any difference. The critical thing is that you feed enough of it. And as you heard me say, I think people feed far too little.
Okay, I think that'll be helpful. And on the topic of ponies who have to have reduced calorie intake, we've got some questions about feeding straw as a replacement for grazing time, and people wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a great believer in straw. It's kind of a bit like rice cakes for people. You know, you think you're eating something actually, but there's virtually nothing in it. Barley or oat straw are good. Don't feed wheat straw. It's very high in lignin, which horses find quite indigestible. Straw is fine if you introduce it gradually. And there's no reason why you can't feed it in a net. It can't be soaked. You can use it to replace hay at about a third of the replacement rate. Yeah, I'm a great believer in feeding straw. I think horses have got to get used to it. You know, you've got to gradually introduce it, but any horse with good teeth can happily chew and digest straw. I think there is an association with straw on ulcers, but as David said, that in those experiments, straw was the only source. So I don't think we can extrapolate from that really.
No, I agree with Kieran that straw has its place. The one thing I would just urge people to do is, as Kieran said, is phase it in slowly, and it just comes with the caveat that I've certainly had to go out and deal with pelvic flexure impactions, you know, where horses have eaten. Have literally gorged on straw and led to an impaction. So it's just like all these things. It's everything's good in moderation and when phased in carefully.
Right, hopefully that has answered some of the questions about feeding straw as well. David, another question for you. Do we commonly find ulcers in horses which don't show the typical clinical signs?
Do we find ulcers in horses that yes, it's a case of never say never. You always get these outliers. If you think of a bell-shaped curve, which probably the 95% of a population will follow along similar lines of what I've shown today. You will get the occasional very stoical horse, which appears to be absolutely showing no clinical signs. And some gastric ulcers are not clinical. You know, sometimes the horses they're there and they're not causing a problem. That does happen. So yes, that can happen. And then the other thing will happen where you get horses with fairly classical gastric ulcer signs, and you scope them, and there are no ulcers there as well. So you do get both extremes. You know, you find ulcers when you wouldn't expect to, and you don't find ulcers when you would expect to. And I always think this just reinforces the importance of actually looking for the ulcers and to actually gastroscoping the horse, as opposed to saying my horse is sensitive when I do its girth up, I need to put it on some treatment, because it may not be the problem. There may be another reason for it. So yeah, common things do occur commonly, but there's always the outliers, and you always have to have an open mind.
Wonderful. You've also actually just answered one of the final questions we had, which was about should we always scope them first to check they've got ulcers before giving them omeprazole, or should we sometimes trial treat? So hopefully that's cleared up that question for a few people as well. I'm aware we have almost got to 9:30, so I'll finish with the questions there. Hopefully we've answered as many as possible. I've tried to pick out some common ones, so I'll pass back to David.
Great. Thank you ever so much, Charlie. That was
Charlie.
Thank you for fielding those questions, and thank you very much to Kieran for another fantastic, laterally thinking, out of the box presentation. We hope you've all enjoyed this evening. We enjoy doing them, and as I say, it is a team event. Blacked out of the screen at the bottom is Katie Stanlake, who works behind the scenes here, making sure that Kieran and I and Charlie pop up at the right time on screens, and we're not on mute when we shouldn't be on mute, and so forth. So big thank you to everybody who's helped us, and please give us feedback. Please, if there are any topics that you would like us to cover in the future, we would like to do some more talks, thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you all again in the future. Thanks very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.